It begins in the cold hours before dawn, April 4th, 1968. The streets of Memphis are quiet, but inside the Lorraine Motel, the hum of distant traffic and the shuffle of footsteps carry an unshakable tension. Martin Luther King Jr. stands at the balcony outside room 306, wearing a dark suit, leaning slightly over the rail. He speaks to friends below, unaware that in just minutes, history will be split into before and after. Somewhere, in the shadows across the street, a rifle is being raised. But to understand how this moment came to be, how the life of one man could shake the moral foundation of a nation, you must begin far earlier, in a world where his dream was still unimaginable. Martin Luther King Jr. was born on January 15, 1929, in Atlanta, Georgia, into a middle-class family rooted deeply in the African-American Baptist tradition. His father, Martin Luther King Sr., was a respected pastor. His mother, Alberta Williams King, the daughter of another minister. Faith, discipline, and education were the pillars of his upbringing. Yet even in the relative comfort of their home, the invisible walls of segregation loomed. The laws of Jim Crow were the unquestioned order of the South, separating schools, restaurants, buses, even drinking fountains. The United States proclaimed liberty, yet millions of its citizens lived in chains woven from prejudice and law. In 1935, at the age of 6, Martin learned what those chains meant when a white playmate told him they could no longer be friends because of his skin color. The words burned into him. But instead of hatred, his parents instilled in him the belief that dignity and love would be his armor. His father's defiance of segregation, walking proudly through doors marked whites only and refusing to use a back entrance, showed young Martin that moral courage was a weapon more powerful than any club or gun. He excelled in school, skipping grades, entering Morehouse College at just 15. It was there, under the guidance of President Benjamin Mays, a man who preached that life's purpose was service to humanity, that King began to see ministry not as a pulpit for Sunday sermons, but as a platform for transforming society. He studied theology, read the works of theologians and philosophers, and wrestled with the moral questions of justice, evil, and nonviolence. But it was Mohandas K., Gandhi's philosophy of satyagraha, true force, that lit a fire in his heart. If love could be a weapon, Gandhi had shown how to wield it, through disciplined, collective, nonviolent resistance. King would later say, "Christ gave us the goals, and Gandhi the tactics." By 1954, King had completed his Ph.D. at Boston University and accepted the pastorate at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. Montgomery was a city tightly bound by Jim Crow law. Black citizens made up the majority of the population, but were second class in every legal and social respect. Buses, in particular, were daily stages for humiliation. Black riders were required to sit in the back, and if the white section filled, they had to give up their seats entirely. On December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks refused to surrender her seat to a white man. Her quiet defiance sparked the Montgomery bus boycott, and a young, relatively unknown minister, Martin Luther King Jr., was chosen to lead the newly formed Montgomery Improvement Association. It was a dangerous position. White supremacists threatened his life. His home was bombed. But King's speeches lifted the cause from a local dispute into a moral crusade. "If we are wrong," he told the crowd, "then justice is a lie. Love is a lie. God is a lie." For 381 days, the black citizens of Montgomery walked, through rain, through heat, to work, to church, to the grocery store. The economic strain on the bus system grew unbearable, and in November 1956, the Supreme Court declared segregation on public buses unconstitutional. It was a stunning victory, not just for Montgomery, but for the idea that nonviolent resistance could bend the arc of history. But with victory came visibility, and with visibility came enemies. The late 1950s and early 1960s saw a rising tide of civil rights battles. Sit-ins challenged segregated lunch counters. Freedom riders risked their lives testing desegregation on interstate buses. Across the South, peaceful protesters were met with fire hoses, police dogs, and billy clubs. White citizens' councils and the Ku Klux Klan swelled with members determined to maintain the Southern way of life. King helped found the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, in 1957, aiming to unite black churches into a powerful network for change. Through it, He traveled constantly, preaching, organizing, negotiating with politicians, and facing arrest after arrest. Each time, he held to the principle that the oppressor's hatred could not be met with equal hatred without destroying the soul of the struggle. In 1963, the movement reached a boiling point. Birmingham, Alabama, became the epicenter of confrontation. The city was notorious for its racial violence. Its police commissioner, Bull Connor, enforced segregation with ruthless force. King and the SCLC joined local leaders in a campaign of marches, sit-ins, and boycotts. The arrests came swiftly. On April 12th, King himself was jailed for violating an injunction against demonstrations. From his cell, on scraps of paper smuggled in by his lawyers, King wrote one of the most important documents of the civil rights era, the letter from Birmingham jail. It was a blistering rebuke to white clergymen who had called his actions untimely and extreme. King wrote, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." He reminded America that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. The Birmingham campaign shocked the nation. Television cameras captured children being blasted with high-pressure hoses, their bodies thrown against walls, their faces twisted in pain. The images pierced through political indifference, reaching the conscience of millions. Even the White House could not look away. By summer, the movement's leaders planned something unprecedented, a massive demonstration in the nation's capital to demand civil and economic rights. On August 28, 1963, over 250,000 people, black, white, young, old, gathered at the Lincoln Memorial. The air shimmered with heat and anticipation. King was the final speaker. His prepared remarks were powerful, but as he neared the end, gospel singer Mahalia Jackson called out from the crowd, "Tell them about the dream, Martin." And so, King set aside his notes. "I have a dream," he began, and the crowd surged forward. His voice rang over the reflecting pool, carrying across the marble steps. A dream where children will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. A dream of justice, rolling down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. It was both sermon and prophecy, a vision not just for America, but for humanity. The speech was a triumph, but it was also a turning point. The nation could no longer pretend the civil rights movement was a fringe cause. It was now the moral question of the age. And with that recognition came a new wave of resistance from those who saw equality as a threat to their power. What King did not yet know was that the forces gathering against him were not only in the South. They were in Washington, in the FBI headquarters, and in the heart of a government that claimed to defend freedom, yet feared the voice of the man calling for it. The applause from the Lincoln Memorial still echoed across the nation, but in the corridors of the FBI, the mood was far from celebratory. Edgar Hoover, the Bureau's powerful and deeply secretive director, saw Martin Luther King Jr. not as a moral leader, but as a dangerous agitator. Hoover believed King's growing influence threatened the stability of the country, and more personally, Hoover's own vision of law and order. In late 1963, the FBI began a covert campaign to discredit him. They wiretapped his phones, bugged his hotel rooms, and sent anonymous letters urging him to step away from leadership. One such letter, accompanied by recordings from FBI surveillance, was clearly intended to push him toward public disgrace, or even suicide. King never bowed to the intimidation. He told those close to him, "I'd rather be dead than afraid." Meanwhile, the nation itself was convulsing. On November 22, 1963, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. Kennedy had, in his final months, thrown his support behind sweeping civil rights legislation. His death left the bill's fate uncertain, but his successor, Lyndon B. Johnson, used the nation's grief to rally Congress. In July 1964, Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act into law, outlawing segregation in public places and banning employment discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. The victory was historic, but the struggle was far from over. In the Deep South, many states resisted the law's enforcement, and at the ballot box, barriers still stood like fortress walls. In places like Selma, Alabama, African Americans were systematically denied the right to vote through poll taxes, literacy tests, and outright intimidation. Out of Dallas County's 15,000 black residents of voting age, only a few hundred were registered. By early 1965, King and the SCLC turned their attention to Selma. Local activists, including the young and fearless John Lewis, had already been pushing for voting rights. When peaceful protests were met with arrests and violence, King called for a march from Selma to Montgomery, the state capital. On March 7th, later known as Bloody Sunday, over 600 marchers set out across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Waiting on the other side were state troopers and sheriff's deputies, armed with clubs, whips, and tear gas. The attackers charged, trampling marchers beneath horses' hooves, striking skulls, splitting flesh. The images flashed across television screens, horrifying the nation. 2 days later, King led another march to the bridge. This time, the troopers stepped aside, but under a court order, King turned the crowd back, avoiding another bloodbath. It was a controversial decision. Some saw it as retreat, but King believed that moral authority was a movement's most powerful weapon, and he would not risk losing it. On March 21st, protected by federal troops, King and thousands of marchers finally set out for Montgomery. They walked for 5 days, enduring rain and cold, and on March 25th, they reached the steps of the state capitol. King addressed the crowd with defiant hope. How long? Not long, because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. The Voting Rights Act was signed into law in August 1965, banning literacy tests and placing voter registration under federal oversight. It was one of the movement's most significant victories. But as the law was written into the books of Congress, the mood in parts of America was shifting. In the North, many African Americans were disillusioned. Legal gains had not erased the crushing poverty, police brutality, and economic inequality in cities like Chicago, Detroit, and Los Angeles. That summer, the Watts neighborhood of Los Angeles erupted in 6 days of riots after a confrontation between police and a black motorist. 34 people were killed. The nation saw burning buildings and looted streets, and many white Americans began to distance themselves from the civil rights struggle. King understood that the battle for equality was no longer just about legal segregation. It was about dismantling the deeper structures of injustice, housing discrimination, joblessness, and the economic system that kept millions trapped in poverty. In 1966, he moved into a dilapidated apartment in Chicago's West Side to draw attention to these issues. There, he faced jeering crowds, flying rocks, and one of the most hostile receptions he had ever encountered in the North. I have never seen, even in Mississippi and Alabama, mobs as hostile and as hate-filled as I've seen here in Chicago, he admitted. At the same time, the rise of the Black Power movement, led by figures like Stokely Carmichael, was reshaping the civil rights landscape. Younger activists were losing patience with nonviolence, arguing that self-defense and political militancy were the only paths forward. While King respected their anger and understood its roots, he held firmly to the belief that violence, even defense, would erode the moral foundation of the struggle. Yet a larger storm was gathering, one that would test King's convictions to their limit. The United States was escalating its war in Vietnam. By 1967, thousands of young men, disproportionately poor and black, were being drafted to fight in a conflict many saw as senseless. King had been cautious about speaking publicly against the war, knowing it could alienate allies, including President Johnson, but his conscience would not allow silence. On April 4th, 1967, at Riverside Church in New York City, King delivered a speech that would define his later years. He condemned the war as both a moral and a betrayal of America's promise, calling the U.S. government the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. He spoke of the hypocrisy of spending billions on war while ignoring the needs of the poor at home. The backlash was immediate and fierce. Newspapers accused him of overstepping his role. Political leaders, even within the civil rights movement, distanced themselves. Funding for the SCLC began to dry up. King pressed on, launching the Poor People's Campaign to unite Americans of all races in a demand for economic justice. He envisioned a mass march on Washington, not for civil rights laws, but for jobs, housing, and a guaranteed income. But the campaign faced logistical chaos, dwindling support, and growing criticism. Some whispered that King's time had passed, that his influence was waning. Then, in early 1968, a call for help came from Memphis, Tennessee. The city's sanitation workers, mostly African American, had gone on strike after two of their colleagues were crushed to death in a malfunctioning garbage truck. The workers earned starvation wages, received no pay if sent home in bad weather, and endured unsafe working conditions. They marched with signs reading, "I am a man." King saw in their struggle the very heart of his message: dignity, justice, and the fight against economic exploitation. He traveled to Memphis to support them, speaking to rallies, joining marches. But the city was tense. On March 28th, a march King led descended into chaos when a small group of youths smashed windows, and police responded with tear gas and gunfire. A young man was killed. It was the first time one of King's marches had turned violent, and it weighed heavily on him. Still, he resolved to return, to lead a peaceful march that would redeem the cause. On April 3rd, 1968, at Mason Temple in Memphis, King addressed a packed audience. He was visibly tired, battling a fever and a sore throat, but his words soared. He spoke of threats against his life, of near-death experiences, and then, in a voice that seemed to rise from another place, he said, "I've been to the mountaintop, and I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we, as a people, will get to the promised land." The crowd erupted. Few knew that it would be his last speech. Outside, the forces that shadowed him for years were closing in, and by the next evening, the mountaintop he had spoken would no longer be a vision of the future, but the edge of an ending. Ask ChatGPT. You said 3. April 4th, 1968. The sun hung low over Memphis, casting long shadows across the city. In the late afternoon, Martin Luther King Jr. stood in room 306 of the Lorraine Motel, preparing for dinner with friends and colleagues. He joked with musician Ben Branch, telling him to play his favorite song, "Precious Lord, Take My Hand," at the event that evening. King stepped out onto the balcony, leaning over the rail to speak with Reverend Jesse Jackson and others below. At 6:01 p.m., a single shot cracked the air. King collapsed, struck by a bullet that tore through his jaw and spine. Chaos erupted. Friends rushed to his side, pointing toward a boarding house across the street. The motel courtyard filled with shouts, running feet, the wail of sirens. King was rushed to St. Joseph's Hospital, but at 7:05 p.m., he was pronounced dead. He was 39 years old. News of the assassination spread like wildfire. Across the United States, shock turned to grief, and grief to rage. In more than 100 cities, riots broke out. Streets filled with flames, broken glass, and gunfire. The man who had preached nonviolence to a nation had been taken by violence, and many feared the dream would die with him. Authorities quickly identified a suspect, James Earl Ray, a fugitive from a Missouri prison. He had escaped in 1967, traveled across the U.S., and was now believed to have fired the fatal shot from a bathroom window in the boarding house. 2 months later, Ray was captured at London's Heathrow Airport, carrying a false Canadian passport. In 1969, he pleaded guilty to avoid the death penalty and was sentenced to 99 years in prison. Yet his motives and whether he acted alone remain subject to debate to this day. Officially, the case was closed, but for many, questions linger like smoke after a fire. While the nation mourned, King's funeral in Atlanta drew thousands. His mahogany casket was carried on a mule-drawn farm cart, symbolizing his solidarity with the poor. Over 100,000 mourners lined the streets. At Morehouse College, his alma mater, Benjamin Mays delivered a eulogy that echoed King's own vision. He believed unflinchingly in the brotherhood of all men. He gave his life for that belief. But grief did not halt the movement. The sanitation workers in Memphis, for whom King had come, continued their strike, now backed by a wave of national attention. By the end of April 1968, they won wage increases and better conditions. Yet the broader mission King had set in motion, the Poor People's Campaign, was left in uncertainty. In May 1968, King's widow, Coretta Scott King, and the SCLC pressed forward with the campaign. Thousands came to Washington, D.C., setting up Resurrection City, a ramshackle encampment on the National Mall. For 6 weeks, they held rallies and lobbied lawmakers, demanding economic justice. But the momentum was fractured. Without King's unifying presence, internal divisions grew. Heavy rains turned the camp into mud. Police clashes escalated. In late June, the city cleared the camp. The dream of a sweeping economic overhaul faded. Meanwhile, the America King had fought to change was entering a new and turbulent chapter. The civil rights victories of the mid-1960s had broken the back of legal segregation, but they had not erased centuries of economic and racial inequality. White backlash intensified. Politicians exploited fears of urban unrest, promoting law and order agendas that rolled back elements of King's vision. The Vietnam War raged on, draining resources and deepening divisions. King's assassination had also marked a turning point within the movement itself. Some activists grew disillusioned with nonviolence, turning toward more militant ideologies. The Black Panther Party gained influence in urban centers, advocating self-defense and community programs. The moral unity King had once embodied gave way to more fragmented struggle, fought on multiple fronts. Yet King's words continued to reverberate. His speeches were replayed, his books reprinted, his "I Have a Dream" address taught to new generations. In churches, classrooms, and protests, his vision was invoked as a moral compass. His belief that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice, became both a reassurance and a challenge. In 1983, 15 years after his death, the United States Congress voted to make Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday a national holiday, despite years of political resistance. President Ronald Reagan signed the bill into law, and the first official holiday was observed in 1986. For some, it was a long overdue recognition. For others, it was a symbol stripped of the radical demands that defined King's life. Beyond the United States, his influence reached across oceans. Anti-apartheid activists in South Africa drew strength from his example. Human rights leaders in Eastern Europe, Latin America, and Asia cited his philosophy of nonviolent resistance. His name became synonymous with moral courage, even in places where his life story was little known. But history has a way of polishing legacies, smoothing away the rough edges. In the years following his death, many prefer to remember the King of 1963, the dreamer on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, rather than the King of 1968, who spoke out against war, capitalism, and systemic poverty. His late career speeches, filled with warnings about militarism and inequality, were often ignored in public commemorations. Even so, there were those who refused to let the full measure of his vision fade. Coretta Scott King devoted her life to preserving and advancing his message, founding the Martin Luther King Jr. Center for Nonviolent Social Change in Atlanta. Activists, scholars, and community leaders worked to keep alive the uncomfortable truths he had told, that racism was inseparable from economic exploitation, that justice required more than integration, that peace demanded the courage to confront one's own nation's failings. By the turn of the 21st century, King's image was everywhere, in statues, street names, and school textbooks. His words were quoted by politicians of every stripe, sometimes to honor his ideals, sometimes to co-opt them. But beneath the public ceremonies and memorials, the question remained, had the nation truly embraced the dream, or merely its most palatable parts? The answer would not be written in marble or holiday proclamations. It would be written in the streets, in the protests, the ballots, the courtrooms, the classrooms. And in the years ahead, America would again be tested by the same forces King had battled: inequality, injustice, and the temptation to choose order over justice. Half a century after that gunshot in Memphis, events would unfold that would summon his voice back into the heart of public life, as if time itself were calling on the nation to answer a question it had long avoided. It began with a cell phone video. A man pressed to the pavement, his neck pinned beneath the knee of a police officer, gasping, "I can't breathe." The year was 2020, and the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis ignited a global wave of protest unlike anything in decades. Across the United States and in cities around the world, millions marched, holding signs that read "Black Lives Matter," chanting demands for justice and systemic change. In the chants, in the speeches, in the shared outcry, the voice of Martin Luther King Jr. seemed to echo. His words were painted on cardboard, printed on shirts, posted online. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Protesters invoked his legacy, not only to call for unity, but to insist on the urgency of action. The streets became a living classroom, where King's belief in the power of organized collective protest was once again tested in real time. For many, it was a reminder that the issues King confronted, police violence, economic inequality, the chasm between America's ideals and its reality, were not relics of the 1960s. They were the unfinished chapters of his life's work. Over 50 years earlier, King had warned that without a true revolution of values, the cycles of poverty, racism, and violence would continue, repackaged in new forms. In his last years, he spoke of the triple evils of racism, economic exploitation, and militarism as intertwined threats to human dignity. The fact that his words resonated so clearly in the 21st century was both a testament to his foresight and an indictment of how far the nation still had to go. King's philosophy of nonviolence was often misunderstood as passive acceptance. In truth, it was a strategy of confrontation, designed to force a choice between justice and the maintenance of an unjust order. He believed that exposing injustice to the light of public scrutiny could awaken the conscience of a nation. But he also knew that conscience alone was not enough. Pressure had to be sustained, and the cost of inaction made unbearable for those in power. His critics in life, and long after his death, argued that nonviolence was too slow, that it asked too much patience from those who had already waited generations. King never dismissed the frustration behind such critiques. He answered them by saying that nonviolence was not about waiting. It was about building a movement strong enough to win without destroying itself in the process. The legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. cannot be confined to a single speech or a single march. It lives in the victories he helped secure, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and in the struggles that remain unfinished. It lives in the work of those who, inspired by him, have carried forward battles for immigrant rights, LGBTQ rights, indigenous sovereignty, workers' protections, and climate justice. It also lives in the contradictions and complexities of his own journey. King was not infallible. He wrestled with doubts, navigated political rivalries, and faced moments when his vision seemed beyond reach. He was a man driven by faith, yet burdened by the knowledge that his mission might cost him his life. In embracing that cost, he transformed his mortality into a weapon for change. On the night before his assassination, in that final speech in Memphis, King's words carried the cadence of prophecy. He spoke of danger, of threats, of the possibility that he would not live to see the fulfillment of the struggle. But he also spoke of the promised land, not as a distant dream, but as an inevitability born from the collective will of a people. History has shown that dreams alone do not change the world. They must be acted upon, defended, expanded, and, at times, reimagined. King's dream was never static. It was a living call to action. It demanded courage from those who stood against him, as much as from those who stood beside him. In 2011, a memorial to Martin Luther King Jr. was dedicated on the National Mall in Washington, D.C., carved in granite. His likeness gazes toward the horizon, his arms folded, his expression resolute. Behind him, words from his speeches are etched into stone, reminders to all who passed that the dream was not a gift from history, but a charge to the present. The memorial stands between the Lincoln Memorial, where King once spoke to 250,000 souls, and the Jefferson Memorial, honoring the man who penned that all men are created equal. Between promise and fulfillment, between ideals and reality, that is where King's legacy still resides. Today, his birthday is celebrated as a national holiday. Children learn his words in school. Streets and boulevards bear his name in hundreds of cities. Yet the truest measure of his legacy is not in ceremonies or monuments, but in the choices each generation makes when confronted with injustice. Will they march? Will they speak? Will they refuse to accept what King called the tranquilizing drug of gradualism? His life ended with a single shot on a balcony in Memphis, but the power of his example did not die. It is carried in the resolve of people who stand for justice even when it is costly. It is carried in the belief that love, discipline, and organize can be a force more radical than hatred. The arc of the moral universe is long. It bends slowly, unevenly, sometimes against the grain of history. But it bends because people push again and again, refusing to let it snap back. Martin Luther King Jr. was one such force. He bent it with his words, his marches, his jail cells, his courage, and ultimately with his life. And as long as there are those willing to stand in the streets, to speak truth to power, to dream not as a luxury but as a duty, his legacy will remain not as a memory, but as a living, breathing force. A dream worth living for, a dream worth fighting for, a dream worth dying for,